Hi. Hardy Boys, the Sinister Signpost, Chapter 5, A Close Call. Remember Chapter 4, they had succeeded in getting fingerprints from their prime suspect, and Bartow Seagore. Turns out the guy's not a crook after all. So they don't know who the bad guys is in this thing. So Chapter 5 is called A Close Call. The next day and a half at the plant proved disappointing for the boys. Despite their meticulous investigation, they failed to come up with a suspect. "I'm ready to tackle this case from another angle," Frank said. "We may as well give up our undercover work here at the plant. Nothing more we can do." "What do you have in mind?" Joe asked. Looking into the accidents involving Alden's experimental race cars. "You think there's some connection between the accidents and the stealing of the motor specifications?" Frank shrugged. "I don't know. Each of the cars was equipped with a prototype model of the motor. Yet why would anyone risk destroying the cars if that's what they were after?" "Let's have a talk with Alden," Joe suggested. And by the way, I'm on page 38 if you're following along with your fingers. In a little while, the boys were seated in the president's office. "So, you want to investigate the accidents," Alden said. "That's okay with me." "We'd like to have a talk with the drivers," Frank replied. "You'll find them in the garage opposite the research department," Alden told them. "They're getting another one of my cars ready for a road race competition that's coming up. Their names are Jim Marcus and Speed Johnson." Frank and Joe made their way toward a large metal-covered building. Inside, a crew of mechanics was busy working on a bright red experimental race car. "Hey, that could be this one here on the cover, with the ray coming off the danger sign right into the driver's eyeballs and the tire coming off. We'll see." Two wiry young men in their mid-20s were watching the proceedings. They turned when the boys called out the names of the drivers. "I'm Jim Marcus," one of them said. "And my name's Speed Johnson," announced the other. Speed Johnson is a great name for a race car driver, don't you think? There used to be one called Fireball Roberts around here. "What can we do for you?" Frank and Joe questioned the drivers about their accidents. They told the Hardys that Alden had entered the experimental vehicles in the competitions in order to match their performance against other makes of cars. The explanation of the accidents were the same as Alden had given, except for a couple of interesting facts. First, each of the drivers had experienced a crazing of the windshield immediately after turning a sharp bend in the road. Shortly before it happened, each of them recalled seeing a sign marked "Danger." That's what this sign says. Danger. "Would you show us on a map where the accidents took place?" Frank asked. "Sure thing," Johnson replied. He took out a road map. You'll have to ask your parents what a road map is. He took out a road map and spread it on the floor. "Mine happened here," he said, jabbing a finger at the spot along a winding red line. Marcus stooped beside his companion. "And my accident took place right here," he added, marking the location with a pencil. "Sorry, I don't have a map to show you." The boys thanked the drivers for their help, then left, taking the map with them. "The road isn't far from here," Frank commented. "Joe, let's drive there and take a look around." Half an hour later, the Hardys were guiding their convertible along a narrow, winding road. They arrived at the sharply curved segment indicated by Johnson and stopped. "This is the spot," Frank remarked, "but I don't see a sign marked Danger." The boys got out and walked along the shoulder of the road. "Look," Joe exclaimed, pointing down at the ground. "There's a little mound of dirt. Somebody has filled in a small hole." "You're right," his brother agreed. "That's where the sign must have been. But why was it taken away?" Puzzled, the boys returned to their car and drove on to the spot where Marcus had said he had his accident. It proved to be another sharply curved segment of the road. The Hardys again examined the shoulder and found a similar mound of dirt. "Strange," Frank muttered. "I think we're on to something. The only problem is, what?" It was getting late, so the boys decided to drive home. When they arrived, Mrs. Hardy rushed out of the house to meet them. "Something has happened to your Aunt Gertrude," she cried out. "Where is she?" Frank asked. "In the living room." The boys quickly followed their mother inside. There they found Aunt Gertrude slumped in a chair. Mrs. Hardy had placed a wet towel on her forehead. "What's wrong, Aunt Gertrude?" Frank asked. Miss Hardy suddenly came to life. "The telegram I just received," she moaned. "What a dreadful inheritance. Read it." And here's a picture of Aunt Gertrude in a chair. She's the aunt. And here's Mom. And there's Frank and Joe bending over her. And the telegram is on the ground. Telegram is like a letter that you get overnight, except it's not an email, it's a piece of paper. The boys looked down and saw the telegram on the floor beside their chair. Joe picked it up and they read the message. Both tried hard not to laugh. "So that's what this is all about," Frank said finally. "You've inherited a stable of racehorses." "A stable of retired racehorses, you mean?" she exclaimed. "They're the worst kind. They've already fleeced the public." Mrs. Hardy smiled. "I think it's wonderful," she commented. "You might get to like horses. They seem to grow on you in time." "Laura, how can you say such a thing?" Aunt Gertrude rebuked her. She slumped back in her chair. "And to think that this was wished on me by an old friend I forgot even existed. She apparently has no heirs, no kids, nobody else to leave them to." "Where's the stable located?" Joe queried. "In Baltimore," his aunt replied. "Even that is too close for me." "They're somewhere up in New York, on the East Coast." "What do you plan to do with it?" Frank asked. "Sell the place," Aunt Gertrude shot back, "and the quicker the better." "Now calm down," Mrs. Hardy urged. "Tomorrow we'll telephone the attorney handling the estate and see what this is all about." Aunt Gertrude remained silent all through supper. Finally, a teasing cry of "Get out!" from Joe sent her storming out of the room. No sense of humor. The next morning, the boys went straight to Alden's office. They told him about the signs the drivers had mentioned and of their own investigation. "Sounds mysterious," Alden remarked, "but what harm could a sign do?" "I can't answer that at the moment," Frank admitted, "but I have a hunch it has something to do with the accidents." Alden eyed the boys with interest. "How do you plan to follow up your hunch?" "The last time we talked," Frank recalled, "you said that another of your experimental cars was being readied for a road race competition." "That's right. In fact, the race is scheduled for tomorrow." "Where is it to take place?" Frank asked. "On a road, not far from the one where accidents happen." "Why?" Alden asked. "If you'll point out the road for us on the map," Frank explained, "Joe and I will travel the route shortly before the race starts. Maybe we'll spot one of those signs. At least it's worth a try." Alden pulled a map from his desk drawer and indicated the road to be used for the competition. Then the boys returned home and discussed the plan for their father. "You know what? I think that's what this picture is." The boys were out investigating. Here comes the race car, and the ray shoots right down. I bet that's what's coming up. "You might be onto something," Mr. Hardy said. "I'll drive the route with you." "Thanks, Dad," Frank replied, "but we weren't going to use the car." "You're not planning to walk all the way?" the detective asked with a look of astonishment. "The race will be over a course of several miles." "We discussed it on the way home, Dad," Joe put on. "We plan to use our old bicycles. They're still stored in the garage." Mr. Hardy leaned back in his chair and grinned. "I get it. Bicycles are noiseless. And if there's anything between this sign theory of yours, you won't scare off whoever is setting them up." "Exactly," Frank replied. Before retiring for the night, the boys went to the garage and inspected the bicycles. "The tires have to be inflated, and a few drops of oil are needed here and there," Joe observed. "Otherwise, they're in good shape." Remember, the boys can drive cars now, so they're not riding bikes as often. "I wonder if they have helmets." It took only a few minutes to do the job. Then they rode their bicycles once around the block for a quick test run. "Let's load the bikes in our car," Frank suggested, "so we'll be all set to go first thing in the morning." Frank and Joe got an early start. Mr. Hardy accompanied them to the starting line. There were about 20 stock cars lined up for the race. Each was painted in a different color scheme. Drivers and mechanics were milling around waiting for the contest to begin. Alden was there and greeted the Hardys. "How much time do we have before the race gets underway?" Frank asked him. "About 30 minutes. My car will be the first one off. Johnson's the driver." "Then we better get going right away," Frank declared. "Be careful," Mr. Hardy urged. The young detectives lifted their bicycles from the trunk, then pedaled down the road. After they had covered most of the route, Joe sighed, "I'd forgotten how slow bicycling can be." "Keep going," his brother said. "The race will be starting any second now, and it won't take the cars long to travel this far. We should cover as much of the route as we can before they do." As the boys continued, they noticed that the road was becoming treacherous for racing. It was flanked on one side by a rocky wall, and on the other by a sloping embankment with a drop of nearly 100 feet. Look, you can see there's a rocky wall, and it's going to fall off the cliff over 100 feet. Eventually, Frank and Joe came to a sharp bend in the road. As they rounded it, Frank suddenly locked his brakes. Joe did the same. Just ahead was a large sign marked "Danger." "Leaping lizards," Joe declared in a hushed voice. "That sign is exactly like the ones Johnson and Marcus described to us," Frank observed. "Let's take a look at it. Maybe we're being watched." "That's a chance we'll have to take." The boys laid their bicycles on the embankment and began walking toward the sign. When they reached it, they stopped and gazed at its face. "What do you make of it?" Joe queried. "Seems quite ordinary, except for one thing," Frank answered. "It's much thicker than most signs." At that instant, the young detectives heard a faint, whirring noise. "What's that?" Joe said. Frank listened. "I'd say it's a generator of some kind," he concluded. "It's coming from a spot a little farther down the road." The boys began to inch their way toward the source of the sound. Suddenly, the roar of a motor became distinct. Each second it grew louder. "The first of the race cars is coming," Joe exclaimed. The Hardys turned just in time to see Alden's entry tearing around the sharp curve of the road. Suddenly, it began to swerve out of control. The vehicle bounced into the air and hurtled directly toward the Hardys. And that's the end of this chapter. But we can't stop there. Let's go on to chapter 6. Final warning. The race car plunged toward Frank and Joe like some horrible monster, eager to crush its prey. In a desperate move, the boys leaped down the embankment and went tumbling head over heels to the bottom. They lay stunned. The next thing they knew, Mr. Hardy and Alden were leaning over them. "Are you all right?" their father asked anxiously. I'm okay," Frank assured him. "Me too," Joe added, rubbing his head gingerly. One of the other drivers, I don't know who Ginger is, but she's rubbing his head. "One of the other drivers saw that there had been an accident and reported it," Alden said. "We got here just as fast as we could." Frank sprang to his feet. "Your driver, Johnson, how was he?" "Fine, except for a few bruises," Alden replied. He grinned. "I build very strong cars. My drivers are well protected." The boys told the two men what they had seen. "And you say that there was a signpost marked 'Danger'?" Mr. Hardy asked curiously. "Where?" Frank pointed toward the top of the embankment. "The one right—" He stopped. He broke off. His words trailed off. "Why, it's gone!" Joe exclaimed. The boys led the way up the embankment. Then they slowly walked along the shoulder of the road. In a minute, they discovered a small hole that had been hastily filled in. "Here's the place," Frank said. "This is where we saw the sign." "I'd call it a sinister signpost," Mr. Hardy remarked, rubbing his chin dubiously, which is the name of this book. "It's here one minute and gone the next. Obviously, someone has carried it off." Joe casually thrust his hands into the pockets of his jacket. A moment later, his face showed surprise, and he pulled a piece of paper from one of his pockets. On it was a printed message. "This is a final warning. Hands off the Alden case." "They must have put this in my pocket while we were lying at the bottom of the embankment," Joe said. "We can be sure of one thing," Frank added. "Whoever is after Mr. Alden's experimental motor is also responsible for the accidents." A car roared up and screeched to a halt. Its driver, one of Alden's race car mechanics, leaped out. "Mr. Alden," he shouted excitedly, "we just received a car from one of the watchmen at the plant. The research department is on fire." "We'll drive you there," Mr. Hardy offered. "There might be some connection with the accident here." "You think?" He and his sons hopped into the boys' convertible with Alden. By the time they arrived at the plant, the flames were completely extinguished. Firemen began to rummage through a charred area that once was Alden's research shop. "This is a terrible blow to my experimental project," he muttered. The Hardys expressed their regret, then went to talk to the fire chief. "I can't say what caused the fire," the chief told them. "We'll have to conduct an investigation first." "Approximately when did it start?" Frank asked. "We got the alarm about an hour ago." "I'd appreciate knowing the results of your investigation," Mr. Hardy said, as he presented his credentials to the fire chief. The man recognized his name immediately. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir, and these two boys must be your sons Frank and Joe. My name's Fred Evans." There was an exchange of handshakes. "You can count on me," the fire chief continued. "I'll let you know if we uncover anything." The Hardys thanked him, then rejoined Alden, who was picking his way through the rubble of his burned shop. "There's nothing left to salvage," he said dejectedly. "However, I'll set up a temporary research shop in one of the other buildings." The Hardys expressed their regrets at Alden's loss and returned home. Aunt Gertrude was still greatly upset over her inheritance of a stable filled with retired racehorses. "Fenton," she exclaimed, "you promised to call the attorney who's handling the estate, and you never did. Please do it right away. I can't rest thinking about that awful place." Mr. Hardy went to telephone, while the boys had a snack of sandwiches and milk in the kitchen. A few minutes later, their father hurried into the room. "I still have the attorney on the line," Mr. Hardy said. "He'd like us to take a look at the stables. However, I have too much work to clean up here, and I'm sure your aunt won't go. So why don't you two boys hop down to Maryland?" "Sure thing, Dad," Frank replied. Mr. Hardy completed his call, then gave Frank and Joe their instructions. "You can catch an early train to Baltimore in the morning," the detective explained. "The attorney will meet you at the station there. He'll be waiting in front of the information desk. His name is Steve Benson." Frank and Joe left Bayport above the 7 o'clock train in the morning. It was nearly noon when they arrived in Baltimore. The boys went directly to the information desk and noticed a tall, even-featured man standing nearby. He appeared to be in his late 50s and was impeccably dressed. "Mr. Benson?" Frank queried. "Yes," the man answered, "and you must be the Hardys. I've heard a lot about you and your father." He extended his hand in greeting. "My car is just outside. The stable isn't far from here." The boys enjoyed the drive through the lush green countryside. During the journey, the attorney discussed Aunt Gertrude's situation. "Your father says that she wants to sell the stable as soon as possible," Benson remarked. "We shouldn't have any trouble doing that. In fact, Norman Fowler, the temporary manager out there, would like to buy the place. Unfortunately, he doesn't have the money right now." Nearly an hour passed before Benson guided his car through an arched gateway. Spread across the arch in gold letters was the name Southern Pines Stables. "All told, there are about 20 acres here," the attorney announced. "It's not very big, but it's adequate for the purpose." Ahead, the boys saw a small house and two other wooden structures. All were painted white and appeared to be in excellent condition. The largest of the buildings contained the stalls for the horses. To the left was a large grassy area surrounded by a wooden fence. About a dozen fine-looking horses were lazily grazing there. Benson brought the car to a stop near the house and got out. The young detectives followed. Standing on the porch was a bulky, deeply tanned man whom the attorney introduced to the boys as Norman Fowler. "The Hardys have come to take a look around," Benson told him. "Glad to be of service," Fowler said cordially. "As you probably know, all the horses here have seen the last of their racing days. The owners want to provide for a comfortable retirement for them. That's our job." The manager invited his guests into the house for lunch and then took him on a tour of the stables. As the day drew to a close, Fowler suggested that the boys remain overnight and return to Bayport in the morning. "All my stable hands are away for the evening at a local affair," he said, "and the bunkhouse is empty. You can sleep there." Benson announced that he had to leave, but promised to return in the morning to drive the Hardys to the railroad station. After a quick supper prepared by Fowler, Frank and Joe went to the bunkhouse. At 10 o'clock, they retired for the night. But little more than an hour had passed when the boys were awakened by the muffled sound of men talking. "That's odd," Frank whispered. "I thought all of Fowler's stable hands were away for the evening." The boys dressed and crept out of the bunkhouse toward the source of the voices. "We want 50% of the take," they heard one man say. Joe accidentally stepped on a twig, which snapped with a cracking noise. The boys froze in their tracks and listened. There was only silence. "Let's move ahead and try to get a glimpse of the men," Frank hissed. The young detectives cautiously edged their way through the darkness. They saw no one. Then, suddenly, a voice boomed out from behind them. "Stay where you are." The boys turned to find themselves peering into the muzzle of a rifle. "Who are you?" Joe demanded. The armed man directed the beam of a flashlight into the faces of the Hardys. "Oh, it's you boys," he said. "I thought you were asleep." The man flicked the beam of light into his own face. "Mr. Fowler!" Frank exclaimed. We heard some men talking out here, Joe explained, and came to investigate. Did you see them? The manager questioned. No, Frank replied. We never got close enough. Well, I heard them too, Fowler said, but I'm sure they were workers from the farm just across the way. They often use our area as a shortcut when they walk back from town. He then said goodnight and went into the house. It's very suspicious, isn't it? Frank and Joe rose early the next morning. After they had finished breakfast, Benson arrived to take them to the railroad station. The boys thanked Fowler for his hospitality, then hurried off to the train. During the drive, the attorney explained some of the legal points involved in their aunt's intended sale and handed them some documents that she was to examine. When they arrived in Bayport, the boys wasted no time in telling Aunt Gertrude and their parents what they had seen. It's too bad you want to sell the stable, Joe said. The place is beautiful. Say no more, their aunt retorted. Just give me the documents the lawyer wants me to read so I can get it over with. Once your aunt makes up her mind, Mr. Hardy commented, there is no changing it. The following morning, Alden telephoned Mr. Hardy. Come to the Clayton police station right away, he requested. There's a thief down here who's been stealing information on my experimental motor. Sounds like things are coming to a head here. Well, that's the end of the chapter. Next is chapter 7. It's called The Elusive Stranger. Stay tuned.